Opening the king's diagonal immediately stakes a claim in the center, preparing development and potentially unleashing diagonals. Instantly ignites a tactical duel, challenging white's central influence and promising dynamic counterplay. Developing the knight to its natural square, preparing to push the d-pawn and contest the center's freedom. Developing the knight to a central square prepares for active play and contests the d4 push. Opening this central diagonal immediately challenges black's pawn structure and ignites the tactical fireworks. Opening the center strategically. This exchange immediately challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces. Knight leaps to freedom, seizing central control and opening lines for piece development. Opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop and preparing central pawn advances creates a more flexible pawn structure. Developing another knight solidifies control of the center and prepares for rapid castling, hinting at a swift attack. This queen deployment prepares for king's side pawn advances and centralizes the piece effectively. Building a fianchettoed bishop on g2 aims to exert long-range pressure along the h1a8 diagonal, potentially targeting black's queenside or preparing for a kingside attack if black castles there. This move is a positional choice, solidifying white's central presence and preparing for a harmonious development of pieces. Prioritizing long-term strategic goals over immediate tactical skirmishes. Developing the knight to its most natural outpost now perfectly harmonizes with the pawn structure, setting the stage for a dynamic Sicilian struggle where control of the central files becomes paramount. Instantly injecting pressure. White's knight hops forward, eyeing the queen and creating immediate tactical possibilities by disrupting black's developing harmony and probing for weaknesses in the queenside structure. Retreating the queen to b8 abandons the fight for central squares and relinquishes the pressure on white's knight, allowing white to develop freely while black's queen remains somewhat passive, potentially inviting further piece development from white towards the center. Opening up the bishop's diagonal and solidifying control over the d5 square. White anticipates potential pawn breaks while preparing for kingside castling. This develops a piece actively, eyeing the queenside where black's queen has retreated to a somewhat passive square. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to challenge the bishop's formidable diagonal. This knight redeployment aims to neutralize white's aggressive pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Anchoring the bishop on this diagonal reinforces control over the kingside and prepares for potential pawn pushes, while also keeping an eye on black's slightly exposed queen. Bringing the bishop to the center develops a piece and prepares to castle. But it also invites immediate pressure on its squares and potentially creates a target for future pawn advances. Trading off that central knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure and opens lines that might otherwise remain closed, potentially creating isolated pawns for black later. This exchange, while simplifying the position, also concedes immediate central control, a crucial element that needs careful management from this point onward. Liberating the queen from its cramped post. This sortie immediately challenges the bishop's placement and opens vital diagonals for black's pieces, hinting at a more active middle game initiative by forcing white to decide the fate of that influential bishop. Aggressively challenging black's central queen and the knight on e5. This move aims to seize initiative by disrupting black's seemingly solid setup, though it creates a lingering weakness on the kingside that demands vigilant defense. Returning the queen to its previous square now creates a curious spatial tension, effectively inviting white to continue its aggressive central advance while simultaneously abandoning any immediate pressure on the d4 pawn. Pushing that pawn forward now. White aims to cramp black's queenside, potentially trapping the knight or forcing it to a less active square, while simultaneously opening a diagonal for the bishop and building a central pawn chain. A dynamic endeavor that sacrifices some immediate structural integrity for potential future attacking prospects. Black immediately challenges the misplaced knight, seeking to disrupt white's advanced pawn structure. The queen, after its slightly passive sojourn on b8, now finds a more active role, creating immediate pressure. This move aims to dismantle white's perceived spatial advantage, forcing a decision regarding the knight's future. Observe how the pawn advance on e5, while offering some central control, has also created weaknesses, which black is now effectively probing. Opening up lines towards the black king is the core idea here, disrupting black's somewhat passive development and seizing the initiative. A bold grab of material, sacrificing your knight for 2 pawns to shatter white's queenside pawn structure and open lines towards their king. However, this creates an exposed king for yourself and gives white immediate counterplay, potentially leading to a rapid development advantage and initiative. The apparent pawn sacrifice opens a direct line to black's castled king, transforming the game into a sharp, tactical struggle where precise calculation is paramount. Initiating a daring counterattack to liberate the cramped knight, this move actively contests the open g-file and prepares to challenge white's potentially exposed king. A bold pawn sacrifice opens up the crucial g-file and aims to exploit black's somewhat compromised kingside pawn structure, potentially unleashing a dangerous attack. Developing the bishop to e7 completes the kingside pawn structure's safety net and prepares for castling, aiming to connect the rooks for future activity. Unleashing the queen onto the queenside opens up a broad spectrum of threats, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's rook and the exposed nature of its king, while simultaneously preparing to sweep away any lingering defenses with superior material advantage. A daring gambit of sorts. Black abandons the b5 pawn and sacrifices material, but with the intention of opening up the a-file for potential counterplay. This energetic maneuver aims to dislodge white's well-placed knight and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Observe how the rook's bold repositioning disrupts white's anticipated development and introduces a dynamic element into an otherwise tense middle game, forcing white to immediately address the new threat. Unleashing a knight's swift assault, Nf6 targets the king's immediate safety, forcing a reaction and disrupting black's developing harmony, all while maintaining a strong central presence. Shattering the attempted queenside blockade, this capture finally surrenders the pawn majority to white's centralized pieces, creating an open diagonal for the white queen to potentially infiltrate in a starkly exposed black king. Reclaiming the captured pawn opens a direct assault on black's exposed king. Black aims to consolidate their position after the tactical skirmish, seeking to connect the rooks and activate the queen. The queen's return to c7 clears the d8 square for the rook and eyes the weakened white king's flank. Unleashing the king on the queenside, white prioritizes rapid development and a potent attack along the newly opened c-file and diagonal. This aggressive castling gambits a touch of pawn structure for overwhelming initiative and places the monarch in a surprisingly active, albeit risky, position, ready to join the fray amidst the tactical melee. Grasping at straws, this audacious raid on the kingside, while superficially eye-catching, completely neglects the mounting pressure on white's now exposed monarch and the open _a_ files. Potential. Safeguarding the king's embarkation point, the monarch shifts to a more secure square, anticipating potential fireworks stemming from the open files and black's exposed pieces, while also preparing to unleash the full might of white's advanced pawns and developed pieces. A bold foray into the enemy's territory, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially snag material. But it leaves the rook somewhat isolated from its defending brethren and potentially vulnerable to counterplay along the opened A file. Unlocking a crucial diagonal, this piece sacrifice aims to shatter black's defensive shell and expose their monarch, forcing a sharp recalculation of tactical sequences around the kingside. This seemingly passive retreat on the b6 square is actually a cunning attempt to regroup, aiming to protect that newly exposed king from the rampant white pieces and to potentially reroute the rook to a more active square like the c file, though its current position is precarious and severely limits its influence. A bold reimagining of the board's geometry unfolds as white dedicates a bishop to a forward scouting mission, aiming to disrupt the entrenched black position and potentially pry open lines towards the exposed king. Unleashing an unexpected pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's centralized control and potentially open lines toward the king, creating immediate tactical complications and demanding careful calculation from the opponent. Seizing the open F file with purpose, white injects immediate pressure directly into black's vulnerable kingside, creating a tactical battlefield where the pawn's advance promises to unravel defensive structures. A bold sacrifice emerges from the chaos, aiming to disrupt white's king safety with a pawn structure already in disarray. Though it leaves black's own monarch perilously exposed and surrenders a crucial piece for what seems like minimal material compensation at first glance. Exploiting the open "G" file with a pawn thrust opens up devastating attacking lines towards the enemy king, creating immediate tactical threats and forcing a reactive defense. Re-establishing queenside pressure with the queen's eye on the A pawn is a shrewd attempt to stir up counterplay, but it overlooks the immediate, overwhelming threat developing on the kingside. A desperate gambit to shatter black's king's sanctuary. But does the exposed monarch truly warrant such a radical pawn sacrifice, potentially overextending white's own forces? The Qg5 push, while seemingly aimed at harassment, unwisely exposes the queen to the open ranks after white's bishop redeployment. This maneuver overlooks the burgeoning attack on black's kingside and fails to contribute to defensive consolidation, leaving the monarch vulnerable to the looming tactical threats that white is meticulously assembling. Unleashing a calculated storm, this sacrifice seizes the initiative and throws black's kingside into disarray, potentially opening critical lines for immediate attack. The doubled pawns on g7 and the exposed monarch create a stark tactical landscape, forcing a sharp redirection of black's queen to reclaim lost material and disrupt white's aggressive intentions. Unleashing the rook onto the open d file now seizes a crucial pathway, potentially threatening black's uncastled monarch and forcing concessions. Snatching back the material immediately after losing your rook feels like a desperate grab for air. But this particular recapture creates a rather precarious pawn shield around your monarch. Unleashing a calculated sacrifice, white aims to pry open black's king and exploit the exposed position, disrupting any semblance of defensive harmony. Recognizing the imminent danger to your monarch, black prioritizes escaping the deadly diagonal and seeking refuge on a safer square. Acknowledging that king's safety now eclipses any immediate tactical skirmishes. The bishop's diagonal penetration, now unblocked, aims to exploit the exposed black king, creating immediate pressure and potentially opening lines for further attack. Shifting the queen to this active square offers a glimmer of hope. seeking to disrupt White's well-coordinated pieces and perhaps initiate a counterattack. Though the immediate threat to White's king is minimal with so much material still on the board. Dislodging the stubborn knight from d7. This tempo-gaining advance forces a critical decision regarding the bishop exchange and opens up lines for further piece activation. Retrieving the sacrificed bishop now is a necessary step to avoid immediate tactical collapse and regain some material balance, though it doesn't erase the positional disadvantages White has accumulated. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank disrupts Black's king's safety, threatening a devastating checkmate if the bishop on d7 cannot be adequately supported. The queen's excursion to the 2nd rank appears to be a desperate gamble, abandoning the vital defense of the king and inviting a swift and decisive counterattack that leaves the black monarch in a precarious, exposed position. Clearing the d-file opens a powerful attack on Black's king, now exposed and desperately needing the bishop for defense. The black king, exposed and adrift on the 8th rank, now navigates a treacherous sea of white pieces after abandoning its temporary sanctuary, unleashing a devastating discovered attack. This check forces the black monarch into an exposed position, dramatically increasing its vulnerability. The king, now exposed on the d-file, desperately seeks refuge, yet the surrounding pawns offer no solace, inviting a swift and decisive mating net. A desperate kingside pursuit, attempting to disrupt Black's now superior material and consolidating position by forcing further exchanges. The king, having escaped the initial attack, now scrambles to safety, a desperate race against the encroaching rooks. Forcing a desperate defense now, the rook's perpendicular threat cuts across the board, aiming to dismantle Black's remaining resistance. The king's desperate dance around the d-file continues, desperately seeking refuge but finding only more pressure as the opponent's pieces are poised to exploit any further misstep. Pinning the black king to the back rank after forcing out the bishop significantly simplifies the position and opens the door for White to exploit the weakened dark squares around the monarch. Exploring the desperate defense, Black chooses to shuffle the monarch, hoping to survive the relentless kingside assault in the open central files. The pursuit of the black king intensifies as the rooks consolidate control over the crucial 7th rank, a strategic masterstroke that hems in the enemy monarch and prepares for further advances. Opening the queenside to potentially disrupt White's king's safety and prepare counterplay on that flank. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank, a decisive offensive initiative emerges, aiming to exploit the unprotected king and create critical mating threats. Unleashing the queen's latent threat towards the exposed king. This maneuver aims to disrupt the fortress White has meticulously built. Seizing the open g-file now provides a decisive attacking avenue, aiming to shatter Black's defensive setup and expose the king. Unleashing another powerful rook maneuver. Black's queen now dances to the kingside, eyeing that exposed white king and threatening to create further havoc. Pioneering into new territory, this pawn's advance creates a potent barrier, aiming to stifle any black counterplay originating from the queenside and simultaneously prepares for an offensive surge that could destabilize the enemy king's sanctuary. A bold choice to bring the queen into the fray, potentially initiating a dramatic exchange or opening new avenues for attack, but one that leaves the king somewhat exposed to White's advancing pawn wall. Unleashing a forceful check, White immediately disrupts the black king's tenuous safety, aiming to exploit the open diagonal. The king, exposed on the 8th rank, desperately seeks refuge, and this retreat to the king's file offers a temporary, albeit precarious, sanctuary from the relentless attacking pressure. Unleashing an open file for the rook creates immense pressure on black's position, directly challenging their defenses and opening avenues for further penetration. Unleashing the rook towards the 7th rank creates a powerful attacking front, aiming to disrupt white's recently established pawn structure and potentially penetrate the king's defenses, all while preparing to connect the remaining pieces for a more coordinated assault. Re-establishing a solid defensive perimeter on the 6th rank often proves prudent when an open file presents potential threats. This maneuver aims to bolster the pawn structure and prepare for a potential pawn push or piece repositioning, subtly shifting the focus from immediate threats to longer-term stability. Unleashing a furious assault, black aims to expose white's monarch by activating the queen's offensive potential against the slightly exposed kingside. Unleashing the rook along the open d-file. This advance aggressively seeks to penetrate black's weakened defenses, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position and potentially fork the queen and rook if black isn't watchful. Black's queen repositions to the c7 square, a central hub that allows it to eye both white's somewhat exposed king and the a5 pawn, while also maintaining a watchful eye on the d7 rook. This maneuver attempts to consolidate black's defensive posture and prepare for potential counterplay, perhaps by contesting the open files or reinforcing vulnerable squares. Unleashing the rook to the d-file creates a potent battery aimed at the beleaguered black king, forcing immediate defensive adjustments. The rook's position on the c-file now offers a tantalizing prospect for disrupting white's consolidated position, forcing a decision about how to defend the vulnerable king. Asserting control over the queenside further solidifies white's strategic advantage, restricting black's minor pieces and denying them any potential counterplay. Opening a new path for your rook to potentially infiltrate along the 7th rank offers a subtle but important positional shift, creating new attacking possibilities while avoiding the current blockade on the kingside. Unleashing the rook to the queenside now aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create breakthroughs, but it might also leave the king exposed to distant threats.